Thanks very much, Bianca. Well, kia ora and welcome everybody. Really appreciate that you are all here this evening and taking this time to hear from me. I'm here in my capacity today really just as a student and to speak to you about the issues I see around care leavers and what their housing options might be. This started for me because 20 years ago, I got into youth work, and for every year that I've been involved in youth work, we've been going to the local family court and using our bail addresses as youth workers for young people to be released to sort of flat with us as youth workers. We've been supporting young people left, right and centre to actually just have a place to stay. And there's been no system, there's been no infrastructure for them. And, just before I begin on my research, there's some real live and present issues that we've got. If we just think of the week we've had a 501, deportee that's come into our country at the age of 15 without their parents. And for me, when we look at youth housing and youth homelessness and care leavers leaving the care system and that youth cohort, that often they get left behind. We have an adult homelessness plan that we focus predominantly on the adult population. We have a child poverty monitor that we predominantly think of children as those from newborns up to sort of 12 to 14. And so that sort of 16 to 20 year old, 16 to 24 cohort often gets forgotten. Before I go into my research, I want to acknowledge all the champions actually that are attending this seminar tonight. We know that you're passionate about this. We work with many of you and want to acknowledge the work that you're doing. So I'm doing my master's thesis on self-determined housing options for young people exiting care. And as I began to look into this area, what really struck me was how much research there actually is on the care leavers cohort, but how little research there is particular to their housing needs. And from understanding the needs of our whānau of any age in terms of housing and their vulnerability, I was quite struck by the lack of New Zealand research in this space, and I wanted to do something about that. And particularly as a youth worker, we work from a strengths-based approach, which is always go and engage with the person that you're connecting with, so the rangatahi, and hear what their views are. Truly listen. Just be quiet and listen to what they have to say and hear what they might want. And often in youth development, when we actually ask young people what they want, they tell us what works. And when we implement what they say, often that leads to models that really work better than what we might have had before. So this evening, I want to begin with a quote from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. And it's a quote that's by Philip Mendes. So he's one of the top sort of Australasian academics and researchers in this field. And he says this: when young people are unprepared for independent living, and when their accommodation is unstable and their housing breaks down, they are at acute risk of homelessness. For some, their pathway into homelessness results from eviction or fleeing problematic shared arrangements. For those who return to the family home or share with siblings, a breakdown in their relationships may be a precursor to homelessness. Others exit care directly into homelessness. So what often happens at the beginning of a care leaver's journey is that they will leave care into some sort of living circumstance, but often they're living with others who have similar trauma histories to themselves. And so that creates problematic relationships, and so housing instability as a result of that. For others leaving care, they can go back into family situations, again, because of the vulnerabilities that can create tension, and again, homelessness can be a result. And for others, they exit directly into homelessness. So what are some of the drivers that lead care leavers into homelessness? So instead of death by PowerPoint, I've got some cue cards tonight, so I'm going to put this up as I talk about them. So we have lack of housing options and housing choice, care experience and associated trauma, rushed and forced and premature exits from care, usually based on a birthday, the abdication of responsibility from the state, the lack of youth voice in decisions for their future, lack of skills to live independently, and negative peer-to-peer influence. So there's a whole host of reasons for why a young person leaving care might fall into homelessness. And it's really important when we think of youth, you know, often we think about the youth problem. Youth are just young humans. Young people have all the complexities in terms of what's presenting in terms of their needs as the adult population, but more because of their vulnerability, because of the cognitive level of brain development that they're going through as rangatahi. They're not fully developed as adults yet. So there's a lot of different drivers that lead a care leaver to be unstable in terms of their housing. So in my research, and I do know that we've got some researchers with us today, so I just do want to declare that, you know, I haven't published my thesis yet, and, you know, I'm very much giving you live information that I'm learning on the go. So if I need a bit of a critique back through an email to Amanda later from our great researchers watching, please feel free. But recently I interviewed a 21-year-old Māori wahine who had been actually recently housed through our Housing First program at Vision West, but had come up through the care system. She fell into homelessness straight out of care. She was on the streets for 6 months. After being on the streets for 6 months, she got into a boarding house situation, not the kind of boarding house or a boarding accommodation that you or I would want our kids in. And that was really problematic for her. She was totally disconnected from her whānau up north. And she was actually only picked up a year or so later in the Housing First program from Vision West after being on the streets and going from boarding house to boarding house. And this is what she said about the importance of housing. Like, housing is really important for youth. It really is. I guess it's your first step to independence. And then after that, you're capable of doing anything you can dream of. So, you know, it's kind of like, okay, I've got a house now. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to work. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. So it's just like, it's your independence. And what's really interesting about what this young participant said in my interview is that actually that the research agrees with her. And I'm going to go into that shortly. But I do want to just say that the research that I'm talking about tonight is predominantly international because of the gross lack of evidence and research focus on housing and accommodation and its importance for care leavers in New Zealand. There has been some work done, some good work done from Oranga Tamariki that actually has shown through the Evidence Centre the importance of housing. But outside of that, there's been very little research done into the importance of housing here. And the approach to housing for care leavers in New Zealand looks disorganised at best and at worst, excluded from the policies and strategies in supporting care leavers into adulthood. And I'm going to go into that a little bit later on. Unstable and unsafe living circumstances for children in care lead to greater vulnerability to homelessness as adults. And if you hear nothing else from me tonight, hear this, that by addressing care leavers' housing needs and wider youth homelessness needs, you are addressing adult homelessness. And I'm going to prove that to you. Australian researcher Philip Mendes argues that multiple studies have found a connection between care experience and housing instability, homelessness, and transience for care leavers. He cites the lack of preparation and planning for transition as a major factor affecting care leavers' capacity and ability to maintain stable housing. The likelihood of homelessness and housing instability for care leavers is much higher for them than their non-peers, non-care implicated peers. And why is that? Well, it's because of this. By the age of 8, most New Zealand children in care have been moved an average of 7 times. Some of those in care, by the time they've finished their care experience, have been moved 60 times. This transience in their childhood can cause some care leavers to struggle with housing stability, even when being supported by stable and permanent housing. So when your entire life has been defined by housing instability, you don't suddenly transition out from the responsibility of the state and know how to actually maintain a property. And very interestingly with this, just recently, my friend Rami, who's done some really interesting research with our street community on when they first became homeless, and one of the findings of his thesis was that the majority of the street homeless that he worked with became homeless first as young people. He sent me this piece of research just this week, and I'm going to read you a quote from it. He said, youth homelessness is not just a youth problem, it's a homelessness problem. As demonstrated by recent Housing First research in Canada, participants who have first experienced homelessness under the age of 25 had half the odds of experiencing housing stability as an adult in Housing First over 24 months. So what that's saying is that when you're a child or when you're a young person, and bear in mind that research is saying children without parents, so it's saying when there's a 9-year-old on the streets or an 11-year-old on the streets or a 12-year-old on the streets or through to youth, when you go in and out of homelessness and then you arrive in the Housing First program, and this is the landmark standard response to homelessness in New Zealand, Housing First, you're half as likely to sustain your tenancy as those who don't. And because we know that a significant proportion of care leavers enter homelessness, that statistic affects them significantly. So what do care leavers say about housing and its importance in their perspective? Well, internationally, there's been some significant research that's actually looked at what are the real needs and the wishes of young people in terms of their needs as they leave the care system. And housing always ranks in the highest priorities. Housing stability for care leavers ranks amongst the highest self-determined need internationally, repetitively voiced by a multitude of cohorts of young people exiting care. Simon's 2008 research indicates that housing is widely recognised as a key priority for young people, being the life area most closely associated with mental well-being. That's really important with what Nicola was talking about before in terms of mental health and what we've seen in that space, and outstripping the contribution made by involvement in education and training. Therefore, understanding what leads to successful housing outcomes and what works well is key to supporting young people moving to independent living. So we've often held as youth development practitioners, education is the gold standard for helping young people achieve independence. But actually what the research says is that you've got to have housing. And of course, you can't have a stable education if you've moved 7 times in your childhood or up to 60 times. So we know that the effects on education aptitude for care leavers is much greater than those who haven't been in the care system. In terms of how many young people we're talking about, and I know there were some conversations about this before and everyone's trying to size this issue, but as part of my research, I did an official information request of Oranga Tamariki about the amount of young people in their transition service. And as of September in 2020, there were 756 young people in their transition service, and only 59 beds were funded. Now, I do know that in 2019, there was some work from OT that went up to government to fund both their transition workforce and extra beds, and the beds weren't funded in that. So this isn't a blame game here, but it's simply to say 759 to 59 beds doesn't compute, that doesn't work. In that same OIA request, OT also notified me that they had 340 young people at that time in September that were currently 17 years old and about to turn 18, which is the exiting care age bracket. So, you know, huge vulnerability there of 1,000 kids just leaving care who our actual care provider, OT, doesn't have enough beds for them. Now, there are some other programs that OT has. They have a program where care leavers can remain in care up to the age of 21, and that's really a good policy that's been put in. That's a part of their behaviour now. But the sheer numbers that we have of care leavers leaving the system and the work to be done there and the housing we need for them puts a lot of stress on what kind of stable housing can be provided. To counter that OIA request from OT, I also did one with MSD, and what I was trying to understand was where are the care leavers housed? So if you've got 59 beds in OT and you've got kids there, where are the other 650 odd or 670 odd or whatever it may be? And MSD could not tell me the number of care leavers that were currently being housed in emergency accommodation. Although what they could tell me was that as of June 2020, 1,800 16 to 24-year-olds were in motel accommodation, and 56% of that population were Māori. Now, I haven't brought up the ethnic disparity yet in this webinar, and I just simply want to say I'm not the person to speak to how colonisation and issues of inequity for Māori have translated into an overrepresentation of Māori rangatahi in our youth homelessness stats and in our care leaver stats. But I will just state that just like every other area of housing where that is the truth, it's also the truth here. A note on those 1,800 young people that were in motel accommodation in June last year, over that single month that cost the government $12.5 million to keep them in that motel accommodation, and they had no support. So they had no wraparound support, not like what Aaron was talking about. So how does this compare internationally in terms of what we're seeing internationally? Well, we know that in America, anywhere between 1 in 5 and up to 3 in 5 young people who leave the care system end up homeless. It's very mixed across the states. In some areas, it can be up over 50% of care leavers experience homelessness in their first year leaving care. In others, it can be 20%. Across the ditch in Australia, 1/3 of young people leaving the care system end up homeless. And although we don't have that destination data here in New Zealand, what we do know is that the experts say that we are similar to Australia. So those who are speaking, those who are writing articles in this place, there's an academic down in Otago called Ian Matheson. He works a lot with Philip Mendes on this. Whenever Philip Mendes is putting out statistics on care leavers and their housing experience in Australia, he talks to Ian about the New Zealand experience. And I've had some time with Ian, and he concurs that, he thinks it's about 1/3. So when we think again about adult homelessness, we've got 1/3 of our care leavers, going into homelessness. And that's really, really significant. And that's actually backed up by some research that we've done in Auckland. So the Auckland homeless count, the by name count that happened in 2018, this is what it said. It said that 44.7% of those who were counted in that research had experienced foster care or a group home as a child. So this care leaving cohort getting housing is absolutely critical. it's absolutely critical, not just for Oranga Tamariki and for us being able to help that independence transition, and for us as a nation to see housing as a right for our rangatahi and to support them into independent living, but also because it's a major preventative measure for long-term homelessness in the country, and that needs to be understood and prioritised further. So what are the models to consider? Well, there's a few models to consider. The one that my researchers brought up that isn't commonly understood in New Zealand is what's called the Independent Living Program. And the Independent Living Program, or ILPs as they call them in the research, is basically where young people will live in congregate living environments like apartments, and they'll have social workers or youth workers live alongside them. So that as young people move into an independent living setting, they're living in their self-contained unit alongside other young people. So learning to sort of be independent and do this sort of adult living thing, but with a social worker who's supporting them. And often it's, 4 young people on like an apartment level, and then the 5th apartment is a social worker. That's how independent living can look like. Often the ILP programs, they have different expressions in terms of how they're run, in terms of the type of housing that supply, because in other jurisdictions, they do struggle with supply like we do. And so there's some ILPs that run more like a university hostel, where you'll have, sort of semi-self-contained units, but with shared kitchen facilities and a more community approach to independent living, like your first year of university. So that's the ILPs. There's huge potential for ILPs in New Zealand, and it needs further investigation. The second model is supported accommodation, which we have in New Zealand. Oranga Tamariki funds supported accommodation places. HUD is currently funding some supported accommodation places in New Zealand. And this is generally the mixed flat, where we have young people, 3 to 6 young people usually, living in a flat together with social work supports. In 2018, there was a review of supported living. The review included a number of agencies in New Zealand, and it was an independent review run by Malatest, and I'm happy to send it through afterwards if people are interested to read it. But what it showed was that the supported living accommodation, which is our only form of housing for youth right now in New Zealand, had mixed results. For some young people, it worked really, really well. The peer-to-peer influence was positive, and it meant that they had better outcomes. For others, it didn't work, and they needed other options. So they probably would be better suited to an ILP program or some kind of other independent housing program. The research also exposed supported accommodation for young people with disabilities. So I won't go into the stats today, but just to say that a huge amount of young people exiting the care system have some form of disability. And so actually internationally that's recognised, and especially internationally where disability is defined to also include people with mental health conditions, there are more specific and more intense forms of both ILPs and supported living programs that are specifically for young people with disabilities, where their transition to adulthood is going to be much harder than those who aren't carrying that disability. And then finally, there's the foyer model. So the foyer model is a model by where you usually have young people living in a congregate setting in the 2nd floor of a facility. You might have, 15 to 25 units. And then on your base floor, you'll have a social enterprise that offers like employment and work readiness opportunities, so live on-the-job training. Some foyer models have training programs on their 1st floor. Others have counselling and therapeutic supports for young people. But it's the idea that you take the supports to the facility that the young people live in, but that the young person, when they live in that environment, they sign up to the education outcomes of the foyer model. So they're actually joining an education program, not a housing one. It's just that housing comes with the education. The best example that we've got of that, well, it's sort of a hybrid of that, would be Sue Bagshaw's youth hub that she's building in Christchurch, where she's bringing a host of different youth health supports into her youth hub there. And then she's got 25 units that will support young people. Where it differs from the foyer model is that Sue's housing is more transitional housing, and it's not education centric in its design. It's more transitional housing with some supports in the same facility. So it's not quite matching the fidelity of the foyer model. And then the final model is a model called Kids Undercover. So in Australia, Kids Undercover work with care-based agencies, and they build semi self-contained units in the form of cabins with like toilet and bathroom and ablution facilities, and also kitchens. And they put them on the back of mum and dad properties of usually caregivers or those who have been caregivers in the past and want to support a young person independent. They also put those cabins on to the properties of extended whānau, and the young person learns to live independent in the cabin, and then has that adult support, but also has a youth mentor that comes and supports them, or in some states has a social worker from a state service that supports the young person. So that's the basis that the Vision West My Whare program has been based on, if you've heard of that, and that's the other model that we have. So finally, just to finish with, what do young people want? Well, my research isn't finished, so I can't completely tell you that, but what I can give you is just some indications of some things that they talk about. So the thing that young people say to me over and over again is they want choice and options, and they want to be asked. That's more than anything. And they don't want to be asked as they're leaving care. They want to be asked earlier. They want the conversation of housing to start earlier with them, and for them to help to understand what it really is, because you don't know it until you're in that place where you need it. And so that's critical for young people. They want time to consider their options. You know, that often, and this came out in all the articles that I've read, just over and over and over again, young people being forced to make a decision before they were ready to. They want someone to walk alongside them and help them learn their independence. So you would have heard in all those models that was there and present in all of them. And very practical things. You know, young people talk about very practical things that they want help with, you know, getting driver's licenses, you know, how to set a budget for their weekly groceries, you know, how to use a washing machine for the first time, how to cook, how to build networks. You know, there's things that often care leavers just don't know how to do, and they want help with that. There's comments about being close to local shops and public transport. Well, we know that from good social housing design, so that's no different than other populations, but still really important. And the Māori young people that I have talked to, they want a connection back to their iwi, hapu and miro. They absolutely want that. They want choices to go and have living options, you know, with whānau. And so, again, you know, I'm not the person to speak into those peculiarities. I have said to Amanda, there's a good piece of research on Māori, for Māori housing that I can send through for you to have a look at, but I'm sure other academics and Te Mahi Pihi and other groups are much better positioned to speak to that than I am. So, look, before I open up for questions, I would just want to summarise by saying youth homelessness and care leavers' issues around housing instability isn't a youth issue alone, and it's not an Oranga Tamariki issue. This is a New Zealand issue. This is an Aotearoa issue, and it comes down to how we treat our children. You know, a 16-year-old is still a child. Their brain has not completely developed. They're our kids. And therefore, we need to work with them as we would with our own kids, and that is supporting them to be able to live independently and not just letting them go, working really hard to support them for as long as they need. So thank you for that. And then just back to Amanda. Thanks for the time.